stimulating. Consistent with my goal to piss as many people off as possible.
Yeah. It's a valid life path.
Yeah, it is. It's my worldview. Let me first continue your Jeff Foxworthy style theme, right? So you know you're a humanist if you read Goetz. For a non-trivial and perhaps even majority fraction of organismic biologists, in my experience, you know you're a biologist if you think your approach applies to everything except human beings. That is, the boundaries to the integration that you're speaking of are not unidirectional.
Mm-hmm.
There are an awful lot of organismic biologists who are extremely uncomfortable applying the same types of integration, I would say, or explanation to human beings. Because I think it's in part because of your Stevie, whatever your acronym. That's right. I mean, despite their intimate knowledge of biology, they make exactly the same kinds of mistakes.
Yeah, because they're people.
Yeah.
Right, and so they've got all that same proximate psychology.
Right. And the second thing is, I want to take issue with your claim that humanists are good scientists.
When they do their work.
Even when they do their work. Because it depends what you mean by scientists. So if what you mean is careful attention to observation, concern with systematic recording of material and so on, then I agree with you. But I would say there's a difference between being an empiricist and being a scientist.
Yes, you're right.
So my concern there is that in my experience, and my own intellectual pedigree gives me a little bit of insight into this since I went over to the dark side, as you put it. Even in people who are not postmodernists, who think there is an objective reality, who don't think it's all just discourse and science is just another culture, etc., those same people are often extremely uncomfortable with the idea that one explanation is better than another. Okay.
Yeah.
So everybody's welcome to their opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
There isn't a community of disputatious scholars that eventually produces a single best explanation, and that is not science.
Yeah, and that's a problem. That is a deep problem in humanities, and there's an ideological background to that, right? And it hasn't always been the case. I think it's a relatively recent phenomenon, the last 4 or 5 decades. And that's got to change, right? You've got to be able to talk about how knowledge can progress. And I can rule out certain interpretations, and we don't like to do that. My field, the field that I share with Lothar is not quite there. I mean, we do say, okay, you're wrong about this, because the Guadian finds show that you're wrong about this claim you have. But there is a kind of discomfort with actually saying, I have the right interpretation and you're wrong. And that's got to change. And there's also differences. I mean, that was too sloppy, saying they're good scientists. They're good empiricists. There are other things that are different about the scientific method that humanists don't do. Like, we don't formulate hypotheses and then try to test them against data. And that's another thing that's got to change. So we have a whole section in the intro to this book where we try to show to humanists, hey, mathematical modeling and these other types of stuff could actually do some work for you that you don't see right now. And hypothesis testing is really helpful. You should try it sometime. But they resisted. I had an argument with a good friend of mine who's a kind of traditional political scientist about formal modeling last night. And what it really boiled down to is he just says, no, people are too complex. I say, well, the weather's complex. You can have math. But humans are, and really it comes down to humans are different. So that's got to change too. But again, it's going to change professionally, but we're always going to still feel like there's something different about it. So yeah.
There can be another difference too, and that is whether you're looking for complex or simple answers.
Mm-hmm.
That is, part of science is simplifying to the point of falsity, but to the point where you're explaining an awful lot of what's going on with a very simple idea or a very simple model. But that's quite a different goal than saying, let's look at this day in the French Revolution and all the factors that impinged on this particular event.
Sure.
Which did, in fact, impinge on that particular event, and how they all combined in this unique way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very different goal than saying, let's look at revolutions and when they occur and the relationship to the system of production or to the social structure or something like that. And that very well explain that day in the French Revolution.
Sure.
But it will show a pattern across revolutions.
Yeah, but then, okay, and I agree with you, that's what I mean about the 90% of what a lot of people do wouldn't change. But the important thing to recognize is that that explanation that day in the French Revolution has got to, at some level, tie in with your bigger story, or it's just aimless butterfly collecting. And that's the problem right now, is I think in the humanities, we're not tying our work into these bigger frameworks.
Because you're implicitly, excuse me, in trying to explain that day, you're implicitly or explicitly drawing on all kinds of explanatory principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the only way to show that those are valid explanatory principles is to show that they apply to a lot of cases.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's this is all out my way. She asked me to stop naming her by name, but she's the medieval coalition formation person. And I think, her work would be much richer, because when she pans out to try to talk about the big explanatory things, she falls back on Foucault, because that's what we were taught at Berkeley. But I think tying it into some of the work on coalition formation and humans and primates and other animals would be really rich and give her a new way to more powerful way of understanding what she's doing. So that's what I think the proper way to understand vertical integration is, that detailed stuff, but focusing on the leaves is important, and it's going to be very complicated. But at the end of the day, somehow you got to tie it into the bigger tree.
But didn't you give maybe too much credit to the neurosciences? When in the beginning of your talk you said, if I understood you correctly, that they completely refute dualism.
I didn't say that they completely refute it, but yes,
I
they suggest
got
that dualism is impossible. Yeah.
Impression from it. And they still, they're going in this direction. There's still a way to go. And maybe that's part of the resentment from humanists, that people present a scenario in which told that neuroscientists have now
proven
that the mind is completely understood through the brain.
Yeah, that's precisely, so Charles Taylor, who we're actually on the same page in a lot of stuff, and we've had an email debate about this, and this is precisely his position, which is that neuroscience has promised this, but they haven't delivered it yet. And until they do, it's actually more empirically plausible to believe that consciousness is some separate thing, because we haven't explained it yet. His phrase he used was, he said it's like the safari promising the lion skin before they even set out on their safari. And so that's where I think it comes down to just how you take the strength of this data. The reason I don't think neuroscience hasn't delivered on that promise yet, but it's gone far enough to suggest that it might. And then that combined with everything else we know about how the universe works, to me, is the kind of weight of evidence that suggests dualism is not plausible. But this is clearly open for debate. I think if you don't think dualism is implausible, then vertical integration is not going to get very far with you.
And if you combine this with something that you said about yourself, that you would,
Okay.
you hate the idea that dualism is false.
Yeah.
And the same you apply probably to many humans as individuals.
Sure.
You can see that how these people must feel, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, no, I agree.
So I think I missed a link early on in the talk about what Darwinism, how it helped us stop being dualists. Because you could imagine that you would have a religious belief that would be monist, and we are monists about, why does it matter where the design comes from? So we're monists about the watch, or dualists about design in humans. So what is it? I missed something about the origin of the design being
The traditional view is that we're dualists about the design of the watch. We don't think the watch just came together from physical processes. We think there's a watchmaker who built the watch. And we see retinas and all this complex stuff in people, and we think somebody built people too. So showing how design can actually emerge from, using Dennis' language, you don't need sky hooks. It could be lots and lots of cranes piled on top of each other.
Okay, but the object that was designed, okay, so now I'm getting confused.
But the watch was designed, so is it because it was designed by someone with a magic force in them that allowed them to design things? The watchmaker is a big, big crane building another thing, if you take the evolutionary view seriously.
But the watch doesn't have, so now I'm confused about the meaning of dualism, because in this case, the watch, the source of the watch's origin is some other thing that's external to the watch.
But it's all physical stuff.
But it's all physical stuff, and the watch itself doesn't have a consciousness or a
Right.
mind. And
So it's all just physical stuff interacting with other physical stuff.
Right, but that's not the case for the way people think about humans.
So you're saying that for when we think about humans, we think there's a creator, and we think that humans are dual,
Right.
like two parts.
Okay.
So it's actually like,
Double
it's
dualism.
yeah, it's nested dualism or
Nested
something.
dualism, okay, yeah. So I think neo-Darwinism diffuses both forms of dualism. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I wanted to push you on one point, maybe just because I'm a damn student. But, I mean, I'm not opposed to the enterprise or the proposition that of both being necessary, humanities and science, but on one particular point you were saying that, well, we should rely on humanities for our conceptualization of constructs and how we view certain things, and I think I'm not inclined to push that in a strong way, right? So point taken that perhaps some people don't know what they're talking about when they're studying religion.
Mm-hmm.
Point taken, but at the same time, for instance, in the kind of work that I do, where I'm interested in things like love, relationships, attraction, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all know cute when we see it, but it's a little harder to get at to study empirically. It has to be reduced
Mhm.
in some way. It has to have parameters, right? And
Sure.
I mean, for me, reading D.H. Lawrence, ends up being minimally informative for creating a construct that's usable.
Yeah, so a lot of humanistic knowledge could be irrelevant to your particular
Uh-huh.
project you're
Uh-huh.
pursuing. But in other cases, so for instance, when you're studying the evolution of religion and the psychology of religion, getting clear about what you mean by religion is important. And that requires some kind of deeper knowledge than most, in my experience, most psychologists of religion have.
Okay. Well, I think it's maybe just important to be smart, right? Rather than
Okay.
so
That's pretty controversial, yeah, it's good to be smart. That would have been a much shorter talk. Just all be smart. So I think you were first.
But, I mean, just to build off this point, I think it also is, it's a limited view of people who study evolution and human behavior to limit it to the people who are doing these weird studies. I think there are a lot of people who are in the field as much or more than cultural anthropologists and have a really deep sense of ethnography.
Oh, sure,
and
yeah. No, I work with them. They're my friends, but yeah. So there are obvious exceptions. So that's what I mean by the second wave consilience people are people who are responding to this and not just studying university students and actually developing sophisticated models.
But I think even, I mean, given that most psychologists are not going to become field workers,
Mhm.
and I don't necessarily think that that's an endeavor to push, there's sort of one alternative that you presented, which is to have more of an integration between the humanists and the
Yeah.
psychologists. Another, I think, is if you're going to work with a weird population, to think of them the way that an ethnographer would think of them.
Yeah, yeah.
Which doesn't necessarily mean you have to be directly integrated with humanists, but taking on that kind of perspective, I think, can help.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And this is, the way vertical integration I think has got to work with things like religion is the team model, which in the humanities we don't do at all. It's all lone romantic genius alone in his office figuring stuff out. And this guy, my friend, was arguing with last night. He's actually got a garage. He just sits in his garage and thinks about things. And I'm telling him, he got upset, because they thought I was suggesting he shouldn't be allowed to sit in his garage anymore. He should be allowed to sit in his garage, but at some point he should be forced to come out of his garage and talk to other people. And so, we're putting up at UBC, we're putting together a couple of big grants on the evolution of religion and pro-sociality. And we're explicitly bringing together teams of historians and linguists, people who do mathematical modeling, then ethnographers, people are going out in the field, and then people like Ara who are going to be doing the studies in the lab. And actually getting them to all come together in one place and talk to each other. And I think that's the way to do it, because you can't have all those different pieces in one person. But then this is why the positive thing you want to emphasize about vertical integration is there's got to be a common framework for all these people to work together. And this has been a problem. In AAR, I started this cognitive science and religion group to try to get people like Ara and Rich Sosa, people to come talk to historians of religion. But the problem is, unless you have a shared framework, they're talking at completely cross purposes. And it's almost comical sometimes. We had a session on the evolution of religion, and I feel like a bilingual kid trying to interpret between two cultures, because people from the crowd would ask questions after like Ara's talk, and he would just be flying. He wouldn't know how to answer them, and it's because the question was coming from a whole different theoretical standpoint. And then I'd have to translate to him later what she meant was this, and it's like, oh, she thinks that? That's crazy. So you can't, those teams can only happen when you have a shared framework, and that's got to be something like evolution. I mean, something, a physicalist model of evolution as the explanatory driving force. So, did you still have a question?
Well, yeah, it's kind of similar to what Stuart was saying. I think some of the benefits that you point out of humanism actually just come from the fact that humanists go out and study people.
Mm-hmm.
And once you add that to what human behavioral scientists are doing, then you don't actually need to ask humanists about their data anymore, and you don't need to depend on them for conceptualizing.
But we know about lots
that's
more.
not-
We don't just go out and study people. We sit in our offices and read texts. We read
Well, but
records
so
of
do the
people
rest
that
of
people
us,
thought
right?
2,000 years ago. Right. So that's what I mean by the
and often
pyramid.
when I'm reading those texts and
Yeah.
trying to make sense of that for the scientific pursuit of studying human behavior,
Mhm.
the concepts that are in those texts and what's the information that's actually there is not. It's really hard to translate it to, as Jeff was saying, to the concepts that I need to make use of, because it's based on a different theory. So the way that you said,
Mhm.
the empirical facts that we document, it's intertwined with our theory.
Mhm. Right.
It's not as if there are just facts out there that humanists are providing that
Sure.
scientists can understand. So, I mean, I'm sympathetic to the whole pursuit, but there is this problem of translation. I don't know how to get around it other than to do that work myself and not be able to really depend on the humanities.
You're going to
for-
learn classical Chinese.
No.
It's really hard.
I don't
It takes a lot of
study
time. But if you want access
No, but I
to
am
that
going
data,
to
that's
learn,
a
to
big
speak a
data
local
set, right?
dialect. And
What's it?
I am going to learn to speak a local dialect where I
Sure,
work.
okay.
and,
But you're
know.
going to learn one. That's
Yeah.
the point.
The point
No.
is we got.
I know, but my problem is trying to access the knowledge that I can't learn myself. And I don't know how to make it work without saying, going back basically to the old idea of consilience and using evolution as the framework, which would be fine with me, but I imagine there are a lot of humanists who don't feel that they can do that.
Yeah, and they
So-
won't talk to you. And so it's got to be, that's why you need both sides, right? You need people on the humanist side who are open to having a new explanatory framework to approach their material. And that's why the teamwork thing is important, because you got to, translating across these disciplines is sometimes requires people to actually sit down and talk to each other. But I think it's possible. I mean, this is why we have historians on this team, because when we study religion, we don't want to just study living populations. We want to be able to look at what was going on in ancient China, what's going on in ancient Greece. And you can't learn all those languages, right? You can't access that on your own.
So do you think that humanists should be trained in evolutionary theory? for
Oh, absolutely,
example?
yeah.
And I mean, how
At least the basics, right? And it's shocking that most humanities undergrads graduate without any knowledge of evolution. So I mean, on our side, what we're doing is I'm training my graduate students now, and all the stuff I used to train them, how to read classical Chinese, but they're also learning about evolutionary theory and enough cognitive science, so they have enough of a shared vocabulary and framework that they know how to say, hey, this is what's going on in early China, this is how it relates to your stuff. I just ran a seminar where we had kind of half psych grad students and half early Chinese thought grad students, and it was great, because they realized, oh, we actually talk about that too.
So then is there something that scientists should be trained in the humanities that we're not normally? Last question, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure what specifically, just because then you get into such detailed knowledge. Should we make every scientist learn a dead language? It seems kind of silly. That's why you build teams, I think.
But you do make them read.
You make them read.
Do read.
Do they read?
It's true.
They read novels. I mean, we're actually engaged in.
Because you also are humans.
We are also humans.
And that's the difference too, is, scientists have access to human level stuff just they get it for free, because they're humans. And the opposite's not true. Taking an
Borderline.
evolutionary stand, well, okay. Yeah, there's some, well, the spectrum theory, right? You know, there are different places in the autistic psychotic spectrum. So,
I mean, Ted, this is, I mean, it's interesting stuff, and it occurs to me that, so when I teach a GE science course, I have a lot of humanities students who hate being in there,
yeah.
because,
Is this Roxford Jock?
yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's Earth's Basic Earth Science Geography 1, right? They hate being there, right? And they think that it's completely irrelevant to them. And I teach evolution, I teach weather, I mean, I teach stuff that is actually very relevant to them, understanding their world. But it always occurred to me that that actually comes from a cultural difference that somehow we're taught really young, right? Certain kids are good at math, other kids are not, right? And so those kids that are good at math get tracked into things that are sciencey, and the ones that aren't try to find their way in things where they can get away without doing math or thinking through problems analytically or whatever. So, I mean, I'm totally with you on this. So, but the question is then, how do you address it in a sort of systemic way so that you can train a new group of people? That includes our current students and the kids who are in elementary school.
Yeah.
To actually come up and be open to not throwing away other realms of human knowledge.
Yeah. That's an institutional problem that's tricky.
Yeah.
Especially tricky here in this primitive country you folks live in. Evolution, you know, teaching evolution to kids at an early age is going to be controversial, right? In a place like Canada, it was fine doing that. But I love saying that now. I've only been there 5 years. Very compassionate, so much fun. You Americans. But you know, this is a problem. So I mean, I don't do that stuff. So I don't teach elementary school kids. What we're doing at UBC is we're trying to come up with actually an undergrad minor where people interested in getting training in both can do a kind of minor concentration where they learn something about evolution and cognitive science and how to apply. And then we're going to start pushing the deans to just change the structure of undergraduate education where to be an educated person you have to understand evolution, because it explains everything. So you shouldn't be worried about explaining everything.
So is that expanding the liberal arts, essentially?
What's that?
Is that expanding the liberal arts? The
Yeah, to
traditional
include,
liberal arts?
but I think, you know, the other thing is there's a personality, as you say, you know, some kids get tracked at a certain point. And this is stuff I've talked to Jiro about, this, you know, spectrum theory. So Crespi and Babcock had this theory about theory of mind, that it's actually a spectrum from autism to schizophrenia. And they've gotten really interesting new data on the possible genetic basis of this, and also the evolutionary reasons of why you have a spectrum. I don't know, was it just Simonton, or is there other stuff on, you know, maybe what's going on with people who naturally gravitate toward the humanities versus the sciences is just where they fall on that spectrum, right? Yeah.
But another way to put it, you said before, everybody be smarter. Another way to put it for the humanities, I think back to the way I was trained in the humanities, is like, be more autistic.
Yeah, right.
If you want to understand the science stuff, because it's, I mean, if you go over to the humanities side, there's just so much, it's just meaning upon meaning, it's all meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I talk to the physical scientists, what it means doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So you could say maybe the humanities in a way are a kind of microculture in which we've got, you know, we've had all of the sort of social intelligence stuff hyper-evoked or hyper-developed.
Yeah.
All of the intention, theory of mind, I don't know, whatever fits under what we call meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuff's hyper-evoked and hyper-developed at the cost of all of the physical intelligence stuff,
Right.
of all the mechanical stuff, the Copernicus.
Yeah.
So once you get to that level of, especially in postmodernism is a great example, if you get to that meaning where you're interpreting different layers of meaning, you just stop caring about falsifiability. It's
Yeah.
about providing a new framework in which I can make, the example that came earlier with the French Revolution, it's like, I don't, you know, in that frame of mind, I don't care about sort of general rules about what a revolution is or how to predict the next revolution.
Yeah.
What I want to know is, what I want to show you is how is the French Revolution different from the American Revolution or different from any other revolution? You know, in a way, other than just that it happened in France as opposed to this one happened in America.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of like, you know, hyper-dualist, like it's all about me.
Yeah. But if it is linked to different personalities, you know, there could be intractable problems with kind of just people at another extreme having trouble really getting their heads around where people are coming from at the other end. But the way to help, you know, the problem is our education system right now exaggerates this. If there was an initial difference, it gets exaggerated through training, and you got to try to break that down, I think. That's a good question.
tree, it makes me think of some people, like you're saying, some people are studying the leaves. And I don't think anyone wants to think of the problem with, scientists or researchers or humanists in any branch is they don't want to think of their research and their work as an example of someone else's theory.
Okay.
Because you don't want your work to be just some sort of subset of what
Yeah.
someone else is doing.
Yeah.
Because it's not. And maybe the other theory will change and evolve, and maybe people in a different branch in neuroscience will come up with a different paradigm at some point.
Yeah.
And you need for your career, for your work to be appreciated in some autonomous way. So
Yeah.
I think everyone's happy to draw connections. And I think people are afraid to describe their work as examples of other people's theory, or to make their work subject or dependent on, something that's going on in another area that they don't really understand, or they don't know where that's going.
Right.
And they don't want it to be thrown away in 20 years when someone else changes their mind. So I
Okay.
think that's,
Another sociological factor. But
Yeah,
I think
and
that's a problem, I think.
I
that
mean, I
needs to
think
be
if
overcome.
people felt more free to just draw connections without sort of making really explicit sort of hierarchies of how their work is related to other people's, they would be much more open to kind of experimenting.
Yeah. Well, another problem is, in the humanities, this is Pascal Boyer gives a very funny talk at our conference about, he calls it the relevant connections model of humanistic inquiry, which is just your goal as a humanist is to make the strangest possible connections you can that no one else has ever thought of. And it's kind of a caricature, but there's something to it, this kind of idea that you've got to be doing your own special thing, and relating it to general principles would actually kind of sully your work. So I think that's true. Yeah.
I'd just like to strongly disagree with that. I mean,
Okay.
everybody else in the room is free to, agree or disagree, but I look at my work as a subset of something that's been going on for
What's your work?
many, many years. I'm a biological anthropologist.
Okay.
And a primatologist specifically. And I look at my work as one teeny tiny little subset of things that people have been thinking about really for hundreds of years.
Mhm.
And
But
it's
you're a
very-
scientist, you're not
I'm
a
a
humanist.
scientist. I'm not a humanist. But you characterize that as something that all of us want to think of our work as.
Well, if you want to
I
get a
was-
job.
If you
That was the
If you're independently wealthy.
right. Then you don't have to worry about it. But I do not conceptualize science that way at
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
I mean, we're incapable of doing that,
You can
and
be a part of a bigger program and a part of a bigger plan and be studying one thing when someone else is studying, something next to you. But you don't want all your work to be dependent on some theory or some paradigm that might shift. You're studying a particular example which has some sort of meaning or validity outside of a paradigm shift in some other, in some higher branch or, some other field.
Yeah, but I think inherent to the entire idea behind science is acceptance of the fact that maybe the theories that we're working on are going to be completely disproven in 50 years' time. I mean, that's
Humanists
entirely
are
possible.
never humanists are never disproven. That's why it's really nice to be a humanist. We'll just stick until we die.
Yeah, well,
And this is one of the problems that has to be changed. But I think your attitude is not uncommon among humanist scholars. That's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Is that's part of the resistance to becoming part of these larger projects.
right.
Is-
I just disagree with scientists being characterized that way because I
Oh no, I
I mean, there are
wouldn't
many of us in
characterize
this
scientists
room,
that way at
so,
all.
um,
And I think humanists who want to be involved in vertical integration need to not feel that way as well.
there's nothing wrong with being disproven, I guess, and this is part of it.
You're clearly not a humanist.
Yeah, clearly.
We come up with our pet theory in grad school and we stick with it.
I would characterize me as scientist. Science
You're
professors want to
psychologist,
all the time.
You hear it all the time.
Characterize me as that.
There was a question in the back. there.
Clark has one.
Okay, Clark. Oh, okay, sorry. My peripheral visions.
I was just gonna say, well, a comment in that question. The comment is, I couldn't agree more about the dualism roadblock that you're talking about. And I would say that it actually is present, a form of sort of neo-Cartesian dualism. You can see it in psychology, even in very, very scientific psychology. There's resistance to, so people in general, including very scientific psychologists, will say, okay, perceptual mechanisms, yeah, those could be evolved. This is a common thing, right? I had no problem thinking about something in the visual cortex is a module that evolved in the past for detecting light or whatever, right? But as you move higher and higher up into the areas,
As you cross the line.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so this is within
Yeah.
the mind,
Yeah.
right? It's all stuff made out of neurons, but the closer you get to the things you're talking about, morality,
Yeah.
choice,
Yeah. Yeah. People get very squirrely.
things like gender issues,
Yeah.
things like that, then people don't like it.
Yeah.
And so
Well, it's,
you can actually sort of rank like
example
which
of-
things people find to be unproblematic, and
Yeah.
they're almost like as the closer you get to the self or the
Yeah.
soul or whatever.
At the beginning of chapter 6, that's what I do. I start out with some questions. How comfortable do you feel with the idea of evolution? That our bodies are evolved, that there might be gender differences in physical abilities, and then I say it's round 6 that I'm going to lose you for most of my readers.
Right.
And that's when and it's when you cross the line, right? And you see that with, it's funny with gene culture coevolution, everyone always uses that lactose tolerance example. And everyone's fine with that. You talk about
Right.
lactose tolerance or
Doesn't seem-
malaria resistance, everyone's like, oh, okay, that's weak stuff. Start talking about anything mind related, people get really
Right.
freaked out. And there's good historical reasons for getting freaked out about it. But I've given Joe Henrik some views about that because I say you're always using these safe examples. Why don't you talk to people about some other examples that might trouble them more? And that would really, and it's when do they trouble? It's when you cross that line.
Yeah. So my question is, do you think, I mean, the way that you framed the conflict between the two cultures, in some sense, makes the objections on the humanist side fairly noble. I mean, you've identified you've made it like an intellectual disagreement, right? Like, we're dualists, you put up Schwader as an example, self-consciously dualist. Yeah, then that seems like, okay, that there's an intellectual good reason for disagreeing with this, right? Maybe it's not a justified reason, but it's based on reason, it's based on a... What about the sort of darker side of things? I mean, in your paper you did mention things like turf wars, that there's part of it is I don't want to give up my area of academic real estate or whatever.
Yeah.
But then there's other things, because it seems like, I mean, they're not unrelated to the dualism issue, but immediately when Darwin proposed his theory, right, he already saw that people were going to see causes down the road for what it implied.
Yeah.
Which part of it was collapsing mind-body dualism, but it was partially other things too, the implications of what that, if this is true, the things that we might discover might be things that we might not like very much.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you think about that, because it seems like that's another part of the resistance, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
If we deny that this is a valid enterprise, then we don't have to worry that some empirical paper in PNAS is going to tell us something about sex differences
That we don't like.
Whatever the issue is that people don't like. And I was wondering if you thought that's a big...
Yeah, so the resistance mind-body dualism qua intellectual position, there's also mind-body dualism qua moral position. And that's another whole separate source of resistance that I didn't talk about, is that people have moral reasons for being uncomfortable about crossing that line, right? And this is again why I give Joe some slacks. I say, look, you soft pedal it sometimes. Why don't you try talking about the stuff that are really going to get people upset and and that's where a lot of people soft pedal this. And we see this also with cognitive science. You've got people doing cognitive science philosophy, and you've got the people like Mark Johnson and Damasio, who, if you press them, and I've talked to Mark about that. I said, you're a physicalist, of course, but he never talks about it. He talks about embodied, and kind of makes it sound nice. Versus people like Dan Dennett, who are just like, look, we're physically, we're robots all the way down, which is the position that Mark Johnson and Damasio have, but they don't want to emphasize that side of it because they know they're going to get resistance, and that resistance is a moral-based one. It's an emotional one, and it's not intellectual. And I talked about someone before about this. It may be the case that normativity is a level up here, and we may decide for ethical. This is Philip Kitcher argues this actually, that we may decide for ethical reasons that we actually don't want to do certain types of research, and that seems like an actual coherent position to me. It's tricky stuff. So you get to talk about lactose tolerance. That's great. I don't know. I heard about this, I didn't read it, but maybe it's apocryphal. But someone arguing that Ashkenazi Jews have had strong selection pressure.
Oh, Henry Hartman.
Okay.
It's not believed it.
It's terrible science. Oh, is that apocryphal? Okay, okay.
Yeah. Actually, Pinker is quite sympathetic.
Yeah, no, I know. I think I talked to Steve about that too. So when you started talking about that, yeah, right. You were going to get really freaked out, and for really good historical reasons, right?
Yeah.
So that's that moral trigger, that button that gets pushed when you start talking about people evolutionarily. And I think a lot of people pushing vertical integration kind of sidestep that by talking about safe things that don't get people riled up. And the interesting battle can be when more of this type of work gets done. How are we going to deal with it, as a society? So, okay.
Last question. All right. Good, because I thought of two groups that I didn't kiss off that I should.
Yeah, right. You want to make sure you hit all of them.
Right. So the first is, and this is kind of building on what Clark said, the neuroscientists. So, there are a whole bunch of strong, theoretically principled reasons why the MacLean's triune brain model is wrong. But one of the reasons I think that neuroscientists continue to like it is because in that model, the neocortex is just the home of the soul, basically, right? That is, this is where all the really important human stuff is, right? So we're comfortable talking about lactose tolerance, right, or visual perception, because that's reptilian, right? I mean, that's all real low stuff. But we all know that the neocortex is plastic, and and so there we have free will and all this. And of course, they're just being motivated by the same non-scientific concerns.
But built-in concern. But it's not.
Yeah, right. No, I agree with you completely about that. We're subject to our own biases. The other was, you had your pyramid and you had the little top section, tip of the iceberg kind of thing. I wouldn't say that I am, extremely well versed in all of the applications to date of evolutionary approaches to the humanities, but I would say that much of what I have seen, I would say is relatively shallow. So instead of saying, okay, so what do we know about the evolved psychology of coalitional structures and how this might inform our interpretation of historical or textual materials, a lot of what we get is essentially the same kind of crank turning that we saw in evolutionary psychology, where people go and analyze personal ads, and guess what? Men lie about how much money they make, and women lie about their age, right? And I've seen the same kind of thing in the applications of evolutionary approaches to literature, for example.
Sure.
And it's just, it's just another template, and it's really mechanical. It's not very illuminating. And were I a humanist, I would say, well, it's trivial, right? And I think that's not an unjust accusation.
Yeah. No, it's a problem in literary Darwinism. You said it, I didn't say it. A lot of it works really bad, right? And humanists, anyone who does literature looks at this stuff and they're just like, this is completely uninformative. So there's a lot of bad applications of evolutionary thought to humanistic issues. But that's not, an a priori necessity. You actually could do sophisticated work. But in certain fields, and I think literature is one of them, the well's been tainted a little bit by the fact that the early work that's done was really kind of sloppy and demonstrably uninteresting. So, so we have to be smart and interesting.